Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to be talking about some abandoned locations that I've read about all over the planet. To begin with, Wednesday, I swung by the Lamar Bruni Vergara Environmental Science Center, which is on Taylor Road at the Laredo College. I went by there and interviewed the director, Thomas Miller, to get more material for my upcoming book on Fort McIntosh. We only talked for a short time, but I learned a lot. If you haven't been out to the Science Center, what are you waiting for? They have a lot of neat things to look at, and you'll learn something about our area. They also have some alligators you can look at, but don't feed them. You might come away missing some parts. It's pretty easy to find. Just look for the windmills, and the center is to the east of them. Way back, I used to live in a small town called Seabrook. Not much to do there, but it was home for several years. The town was right on Clear Lake, and it was right on Galveston Bay. Sometimes it was in Galveston Bay. The place sat pretty low to the water, and any time a storm came through, well, sometimes we were on an island, and sometimes we were underwater. I hung out at a place called the Clear Creek Club. Used to drink a lot of coffee there. If you don't know the place, I won't go into it. But on the weekends, with nothing to do, a bunch of us would jump into someone's car, if anyone had a car that was full of gas and running. We would drive to the island. There was a lot to do on the island. Galveston hadn't gotten fixed up quite as much as it is today, and it wasn't as touristy. There was no boardwalk or an amusement park, but there was a place called Ciarama, and there was the fort. Fort Crockett was built to house the U.S. Army Coastal Artillery Corps on Galveston Island in the late 1890s. During the 1920s and early 30s, Fort Crockett housed the United States Army Air Corps, a 3rd Attack Group. This was the only unit whose sole purpose was attack aircraft. The coast was a target for German U-boats, and so the Army built 2 gun emplacements to protect the island and the entrance to Galveston Bay. 1942, as the United States was entering World War II, a massive buildup was begun to turn Fort Crockett into a defensive fortification to protect the Houston Ship Channel. 2 more giant gun emplacements were built, and the original 2 were fortified. Concrete structures were put in place to protect the 12-inch guns. Then the entire fort was buried under sand. Looking at Fort Crockett from the Gulf, all you'd see were the openings to the gun emplacements. To prevent saboteurs from coming ashore, machine guns were placed at strategic locations. These guns were inside concrete shelters. The only way to get in and out of a few of them was through a long cement corridor that actually ran underground. From the outside, they kind of looked like a giant air vent sticking up out of the ground. Sometimes you'd see these out on the beach, and few people knew what they actually were. Since there was no way to get into them, they just assumed it was some kind of an air system or maybe something to do with the water treatment. As you entered Galveston Bay, on the other side of the water was Bolivar Peninsula. Fort Travis was built to cover the channel as well. This made any U-boat think twice or maybe 3 times before attempting to enter Galveston Bay. World War II was really won by using oil. Tanks and airplanes ran on oil. Germany was lacking in oil, so they spent huge amounts on trying to invent synthetic oil. Even the U-boats trying to sink oil tankers had to use oil to do it. The entrance to Galveston Bay, and thus the Houston Ship Channel, was a choke point. It is narrow, and ships had very little space in order to maneuver. A U-boat could sit just off the coast and fire torpedoes into the bay and sink as many ships as were trying to sail out. With all those 12-inch guns all trained on the Gulf and blimps flying overhead looking for subs under the water, the Germans were forced to try to intercept ships once they were far out into the Gulf, and now they were able to use defensive maneuvers and convoys as a means of protection. There was a Navy blimp base located in Hitchcock, just north of Galveston. Construction had begun in 1942, and the base was commissioned on May 22, 1943. The most prominent feature of the base was a 1,000-foot-long, 200-foot-tall, mostly wooden blimp hangar. The base had 6 blimps that could patrol the coast looking for U-boats. Today, all that remains of the hangar are the 2 concrete supports that were placed on either side of the main door. My mother lived on Galveston Island during World War II. Her dad was a helmet diver, and he worked on the piers and structures at the port of Galveston and in the ship channel. She told me about how, late at night, the guns would suddenly begin firing. This would shake the entire island, waking everybody up. The next morning, the newspapers would announce that the Army had sunk a German U-boat trying to sneak into the ship channel. Well, at the end of the war, the German Navy records showed that only 3 U-boats were ever sunk in the Gulf of Mexico. 1 off the coast of Alabama, and 2 near Florida. Well, if you're going to wake everybody up in the middle of the night, firing huge shells and causing major havoc, you'd better claim you sunk something. When Germany surrendered, the fort was no longer needed. The Army pulled the huge guns, the machine guns, and any wanted equipment out, and they just left the rest to the island. To keep folks from wandering around inside, they placed a little sign in front of each opening that said, "Government property, do not enter." Now that'll keep everybody out. You can park along the seawall anywhere just about you wish, and most of the spots are free. Most people would park their vehicles and then either walk along the coast or run down to the water. To get down to the water, the city had built stairs every so often. Otherwise, it would have been a 17-foot jump to the bottom of the seawall. We drove to just east of 61st Street, and then we would park there as if we were looking at the water, and then we'd gently wander across the road to the old casements. This was a major tourist attraction, and lots of folks would walk around outside taking photographs of the huge cement structures. The sign said "Stay out," but just about everybody would walk into one of the 2 Battery Hoskins openings. These things were giant. They had a huge cement overhang that would protect the guns from any airplanes flying overhead, and the opening was quite sizable and impressive to look at. Police seldom bothered stopping anyone from going inside to get a photo, standing under the protective overhang. You could also walk out the back door since it was stuck in the open position. The hinges had rusted in place a long time ago. To the side of the underground fort was a tunnel running back into the darkness. Depending on which of the two battery emplacements you'd entered, the tunnel was either to the right or to the left of the main gun. Well, where the main gun had been. You could only walk a few feet before there was no light. Sounds could be heard coming from way back in the dark tunnel. If you stood still and listened, you could hear weird sounds like maybe someone talking or the creaking of steel doors as someone or some unknown creature was stirring in the dark. I imagine a lot of it was just imagination, but still, we were young. Stories were told about how drug addicts and criminals were living back there in the gloom. These folks would kill anyone daring enough to venture into their domain. These stories were just that, stories passed on from folks who thought they were true. But there's little actual crime in the tunnels. It was really too dark to do anything. We were there for a reason, and we'd come prepared. We brought flashlights. Have you ever wondered why they call them flashlights? The first dry cell battery was invented in 1887. Unlike previous batteries, it used a paste electrolyte instead of a liquid. This was the first battery suitable for portable electrical devices, as it didn't spill or break easily, and it worked no matter which direction you held it. The first mass-produced dry cell batteries came in 1896, and the invention of portable electric lights soon followed. A portable handheld electric light offered advantages in convenience as well as safety over a combustion torch, a candle, or a lantern. The electric lamp was odorless, smokeless, and it emitted far less heat than a combustion-powered light. It could be instantly turned on and off, and there was very little fire risk. It was risky, to say the least, to be traipsing about in a dark barn in the middle of the night with a candle or a lantern, any kind of an open flame. Bad things could happen. The major trouble with the battery was it had a very limited amount of power. So you walked along through the barn or tunnel, you'd turn the light on, and then turn it right back off. You would get just a flash of light to see where you were. Thus the name flashlight. In 1980s, when I was out exploring the underworlds of Galveston, I had a mostly usable light. It's nothing like the lights we have today, but still it was pretty good. Uh-oh, my cat has come back wanting to say hello. At least she's not in heat this week. Anyway, back in 1980s, we did have pretty good flashlights, nothing like the ones today, or nothing like the light you've got attached to your cell phone. It used 2 D-cell batteries. It's made out of aluminum. The switch usually worked, and you had to be careful not to drop it because the lens was glass and it would break pretty easily, but still, it did the job. It did the trick, and so we would wander down into parts of the fort that others always feared to enter. The tunnel ran back under the ground, and eventually it connected up with the other gun emplacement. See, both of these gun emplacements were connected underground. And there was a lot more there than just a tunnel. The ammunition was stored in a huge magazine, which was divided into smaller storage areas. But the main room was huge. It was 71 feet deep, 100 feet wide, and 12 feet high. This magazine was midpoint between the two guns. There were latrines under the ground. They had one for the officers and one for the enlisted men. Why the officers got a much better bathroom? Well, they were officers. There was a switchboard so the bunker could communicate with the command building, which was located away from all of the shooting. There was a computer room as well. Not a computer like what we have on our desks today. This was an analog device that you had to enter all the information into it, and then it would give you things like range and wind speed, so you could lodge huge projectiles over the horizon and hopefully hit an enemy target. The computers back then were as big as a house is today, so you can just imagine what the computer room looked like. Unfortunately, there was no equipment left. The Army had taken that all away. But still, you could see holes in the walls where wires had run, and some of the cables were still there. The underground bunker had been hooked up to city power, but it also had an emergency backup generator since during a battle, power was expected to go out. To make things just a little nicer, the bunker was air-conditioned. This wasn't for the men's comfort. It was to keep the electronics from corroding, what with all that salt water everywhere. That's why American submarines during World War II were also air-conditioned. Not for the men's comfort, it was for the electronics. The guy with me, big red-headed guy named Scott, had said, as we were making preparations, "Wait until you're in a really dark place, then turn your light off. The girls will be afraid and they'll run over and hug you for safety." Well, his girlfriend, who later became his wife, she did exactly as he said she would. The girl that was with me, she didn't squeal or anything. She just punched me right in the chest and told me to turn the light back on or I was dead. Not wanting to die, I turned the light back on, but not the expected outcome. I wish one of us had brought a camera. This was long before the cell phone and all of its super cool functions. The disposable camera hadn't been invented yet. All those times we ran around under there, and we never got any photographs. We would wander around underground for as long as our flashlights held out. Many of the rooms were no longer enterable due to collapse. The salt water has bad effects on concrete. As our flashlights would begin to fade, we would beat a hasty retreat back to the light of day. There was a second part of the fortifications over near the ship channel. We discovered you could get in, but it was a lot more work. The entrance was a concrete building out in what today is mostly marshy land to the north side of the seawall. The building was just 1 story high, but it also extended beneath the ground. There was a tunnel running in both directions, but the side going west had mostly fallen in. We would wander to the east. There was a side tunnel that led out to a machine gun emplacement that was out on East Beach. Just a small room made from poured cement and sticking up far enough to get a good look out to the water. The floor had several openings that looked like some kind of an elevator shaft. These were all filled with water. Had we accidentally fallen in, there was no way to get back out since the ladder was rusted to the point of collapse. Since there were these shafts going down, there must have been some structure under the one we were in, but it was flooded and we couldn't get down there. The tunnel continued on until we came out in a building looking out on to Galveston Bay. And right across the water, we could see Fort Travis. 1980, the San Luis Resort was built on and behind the site of the former Battery Hoskins. The massive concrete gun emplacements remain dramatically visible from the Seawall Boulevard, even though one gun emplacement now sports a swimming pool on top of it, and the other gun emplacement is adorned with a wedding gazebo. And you cannot get into either one of them. They've both been bricked shut. It's a crying shame that a large portion of our history has pretty much gone in the way of commercialism. They could have built one heck of a museum under there, but, well, I had no say in the matter. To the northwest of the channel defenses sits another odd concrete structure. This one is out in the water. The Bolivar Ferry takes folks from Galveston to Bolivar Peninsula. It is run by the Highway Department, and it's free to ride. Which brings to mind another story. A couple of guys I knew had come up with a plan to make a little extra money late one weekend. They rode the ferry over to Bolivar, and then they went to work. They would walk along the line of cars, and they would approach the driver and sell them a ticket for $1 to use the ferry. These guys had brought a roll of tickets they'd picked up at a print shop, and they'd also put on yellow traffic vests so they would look official. They sold tickets to all the cars in line, and then they took off the vests, threw away the tickets, and ran and hid out in a bar for a couple hours. They eventually rode the ferry back to Galveston. I wonder how many folks who bought tickets ever found out they'd been had. After all, the ferry was free. The ferry leaves Galveston and sails through the water, passing an odd-looking wreck sitting low in the water. It looks like a ship made from concrete. Well, that's because this is what is left of the USS Selma. The Selma was a 7,500-ton reinforced concrete tanker that had been built in Mobile, Alabama. It was launched June 28, 1919. She was one of several concrete ships conceived and designed during World War I. Well, construction was not completed until the war had ended. The ship was 420 feet long, 54 feet wide, and it had a draft fully loaded of 26 feet. Her loaded displacement was 13,000 tons. Steel had been in short supply because of the war effort, and concrete was then proposed as a viable alternative material for use in shipbuilding. The hull of a reinforced expanded shale lightweight concrete was 5 inches thick at the bottom, and then it tapered to 4 inches as it came up the sides. It required 2,600 cubic yards of concrete, which was also reinforced with 1,500 tons of reinforcing rods. The Selma served several ports in the Gulf of Mexico quite successfully. But one day, they ran aground on a south jetty in Tampico, Mexico. This was May 11th, 1920. They had a crack that ran about 60 feet along the hull. Well, the ship was towed into Galveston for repairs. The damage was repairable. The dry dock crew lacked the knowledge on how to do the repairs. They had never worked with concrete. With no guarantee of ever getting a proper restoration, the U.S. government's Emergency Fleet Corporation decided they didn't want to take the gamble of putting the ship back out in service with that big crack. They dug a channel 1,500 feet long and 25 feet deep just off Galveston near Pelican Island, which is the eastern shore. Pelican Island is the home of the Seawolf Park, where you can see a World War II destroyer, the USS Stewart, and a submarine, the USS Cavalla. After being stripped of all valuable equipment, on March 9, 1922, the USS Selma was towed out to her final berth and sunk. Because the water was shallow, the top portion of the hull stuck up out of the water. Although awash when the sea was rough, the ship still looked as if it was just sitting there, waiting to sail. For a few years, people used the hull as a fishing spot. They would motor out there in a small boat, and then they'd sit up on the decks and drop fishing lines off into the water. Someone decided that they wanted to turn it into a resort, but all that never happened. Later, after the ship was in pretty bad repair, the state discovered that the ship was now parked right on top of the location of the Battle for Galveston in 1863 during the Civil War. The Confederates had possession of Galveston Island, and then the Union Army, the Union Navy came in and they chased the Confederates out of there. And a little while later, the Confederates got a little upset about being thrown off the island, and so they went back in and they threw the Union out of there. But yeah, in 1863, there were battles fought in Galveston Bay. Well, now the USS Selma is a landmark, and they plan to maintain it as it sits. They're not going to fix it up. They're just not going to let it deteriorate anymore. So if you ever get out on Bolivar Ferry and you're plowing along through the waves and you think you see a cement ship sitting in the water, that's exactly what you're looking at. It's just a shame the folks building the concrete bunkers in Galveston didn't follow the construction methods of the folks that we were fighting with. The Germans knew how to build things. Guernsey is an island in the English Channel off the coast of Normandy. Even though it's close to France, it at one time had been connected to the mainland. The island is under British control. It's one of those part of but not part of the British Isles. There are several large islands and then a whole bunch of smaller ones. In 1940, Germany wanted to invade England. They didn't want England flying over and dropping bombs on them while they were getting ready to fly over and drop bombs on England. Looking out into the English Channel, they knew Guernsey was there and it could possibly be used as a forward RAF base. So the Luftwaffe sent over a bombing raid and they tried pummeling the people on the island into submission. When troops finally landed on the island, they were surprised to find the island had no military whatsoever. They'd been bombing a bunch of farms and cattle. Well, Hitler decided he wanted to build Fortress Atlantic, also known as the Atlantic Wall. Germany got busy building massive defensive positions all along the coast of France and a few on other locations up around Belgium and Norway. Giant concrete bunkers everywhere along the coast. These concrete structures were built using slave labor. Most of the workers were literally worked to death. They would work them hard, but not feed them. 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. Some of these people would literally fall dead in their tracks. Germany didn't much care. They figured, oh, we've got plenty more where those came from. Tons of concrete and building materials went into construction of these fortifications all up and down the coast. And with that, I'm going to take a brief pause, play a couple of commercials. I'll be right back after this, so don't go away. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Now, Guernsey was reinforced to the max. The workers built over 200 fortifications on each of the large islands and dozens on the smaller islands. These were formidable constructions. Concrete was shipped out to the Channel Islands along with men and equipment. The island was turned into one enormous fighting position. There were 4 305mm guns with a range of 32 miles. There were 10 artillery batteries with 150mm guns. The entire island was fortified, so anyone trying to land would be faced with an insurmountable endeavor. The island was impregnable. All the defenses were connected underground, so that reinforcements could move to any part of the island without being open to air attack. There are so many tunnels under the island, it's almost like a honeycomb. There were railroad tunnels and storage tunnels. One tunnel was turned into a hospital. Of the entire Atlantic coast defenses, almost 55% of the concrete was poured on Guernsey Island. They also shipped 19 tanks to the island. There were more troops on the island than civilians. Germany sent 12,000 soldiers to occupy an island of 6,000 people. Men and supplies that could have been used more effectively in other locations wound up being stationed on this one island. To disguise the military weapons, the Germans employed some unique ideas. Battery Mareus was an artillery gun emplacement which was disguised as a cottage to field aerial surveillance. The sides and top were painted to look like a house. There were windows and a door painted. The roof looked like shingles. The main gun was covered with netting, so it blended in with the ground. This gun could launch a shell all the way to France, and there were several of them. Something like 70,000 mines were hidden all along the coast, surrounding the island. The mines were overlaid with barbed wire, making landing on the island costly to any invading force. Just beyond the minefields were machine guns placed behind feet of poured concrete. The only way to invade the island would have killed too many men. Aircraft would run into anti-aircraft batteries placed all around the island. Ships would be open to shelling from the 150 and 300 millimeter guns. Any landing craft would run afoul of the machine guns and the cannon. And once the men came ashore, there were the mines and the barbed wire, as well as the machine guns to be dealt with. There was simply no way to attack this fortified island. What were the Allies to do? Their only course of action was ignore the place. The invasion forces went into Normandy, France. The Channel Islands were all the way south, away from the invasion forces' route of travel. The German troops stationed on the Channel Islands sat there and waited for someone, anyone, to come by so they could unleash all those defenses they'd worked so hard, well, actually slaves had worked so hard, to put into place. Whether the islands were as impregnable as they say they were was never tested. Battery Blücher on Alderney was tried just a little bit. Alderney was considered too well defended, so the HMS Rodney was tasked with shelling it. Rodney fired 72 16-inch shells. This resulted in some damage to 3 guns that were in open pits and the deaths of 2 men. The Germans repaired the battery within a few weeks, and you couldn't tell that the island was ever even shelled. The German garrison in the Channel Islands surrendered without a fight on May 9, 1945. I'm no military expert, but I really think I could have done a far better job than Hitler. The German army was driving northeast, heading for the oil fields of Baku, where there was enough oil to keep the German army going for years. They might have been able to capture the field had not Hitler diverted a major portion of the army into Stalingrad. The smart thing to do would have been to bypass Stalingrad and go for the oil, but no, Hitler wanted Stalingrad because it was named after Joe. The Channel Island had no strategic significance. Nothing like what was put into their defenses. So Hitler put nearly 54% of his defenses onto this one small part of the whole Atlantic defensive system. Germany had jet fighters in 1936. But old Adolf didn't want to use them, so the jets weren't utilized until near the end of the war. Come to think of it, a lot of folks could have done a better job, but none of us are looking to take over the world. It's a good thing most megalomaniacs are not the sharpest stick in the bunch. Rail service between Spain and France was considered to be necessary back in the early 1900s. The trouble was, the rail gauge in Spain and France didn't line up. A French rail standard gauge was 4 feet 8 inches, while in Spain, railroads used 5 foot 5 inch rail gauge. This meant that the tracks had to be wider in Spain because the wheels on the trains were farther apart. The construction of the Somport Railway Tunnel was inaugurated on the French side in July 12, 1912. A series of tunnels had to be blasted through the Pyrenees, and rails had to be run over, under, and through inhospitable mountainous land. Construction came to a halt during World War I, and then it commenced again at the end of hostilities. Rails were laid from both sides, and they met in the middle at the Confranc, Spain. Since the trains coming from either side couldn't continue to the other end of the line, everything would have to be offloaded and then reloaded on the other train. This led to the construction of the Somport station. The station had to be large enough to handle the entire contents of a train, including its passengers. Most passengers crossing over the Pyrenees back then were the same folks who would have traveled the oceans in ships like the Titanic or the Lusitania. Rich folks, mostly, who wanted world-class restaurants and elegant hotel rooms at the end of a long day's travel. Just as things were getting moving, Spain broke out in a civil war. This once again caused the rail line to stop running. When once again the trains began to run from France to Spain, Germany invaded Poland and World War II got underway. The best thing about the Somport station was it allowed Jews fleeing the Nazis to escape from France by entering Spain. From Spain, they were able to get on ships and sail to other countries. Once again, the station was closed when the Nazis found out what was happening. By the close of World War II, the station was no longer needed since air travel was becoming a quicker and cheaper means of getting over the mountains. Today there's a beautiful railroad station in the middle of nowhere. They had spared no expense putting this luxurious, fantastically opulent station into being, only to let it sit there. I don't think the place was used for more than 10 years. You can ride out there, get your picture taken standing in front of the station, but other than that, the place has been abandoned. When the world's tallest hotel, the Westin Stamford Hotel in Singapore, was completed in 1986 by South Korean company Sangyong Group, which means Double Dragon, North Korea got their shorts in a bind. They wanted to be able to thump their chests and say they could build better, taller, and more wow than their neighbors to the south. Plans for the Yaegoyong Hotel were rushed out and construction got underway. This was going to be the tallest, best, most luxurious, and bestest hotel on the earth. The huge edifice comes in at 105 stories, 1,080 feet tall. And since it was built in Pyongyang, it stands out since there are no other buildings even half its height. It also stands out because it's shaped like a giant arrow point or pyramid. It has 3 wings and looks as if it should be able to fly. The very top floors were to be a restaurant that would revolve so diners could look down at the city below. They could look down at the folks starving in the streets as they dined on expensive cuisine. Now, things were going kind of good up until 1992 when they ran out of money to pay for construction. The structure was in place, but there were no windows and none of the 105 floors had been furnished. They hadn't even begun the process of starting on the finishing touches. just an enormous shell of a building. In 2008, construction commenced, and soon the building looked as if it could be used. Well, at least the outside was finished. The inside was still just bare concrete. But the outside looked good. Well, if you're into that kind of architecture. At a cost of $75 million, which was 2% of the gross national product of the country, this was a country that could barely afford to feed their citizens. The hotel management group, Kempinski, announced in 2012 they would soon be opening the hotel to guests. This was followed by a second statement in 2013 saying the hotel might partially open soon, followed by maybe someday soon, hopefully. In late 2016, there were indications of renewed activity and a report that a representative of the Orascom had visited North Korea. 2017 and 2018, there were signs of work at the site, with access roads being constructed. April 2018, it was reported that a large LED display featuring the North Korean flag had been added to the top of the building. By May, an LED display had been added to one entire side of the structure, and there were reports that the building was being readied for occupation. The doors should open to guests any day now. By July, the LED display was showing animations, so people out on the streets could look up and see a light display, kind of like a Pink Floyd laser show. Still to this day, there are no hotel guests staying in the building, and none of the commercial space is being occupied. The inside still looks the same as it did in 1992. Nothing but poured cement. There are windows on the outside, and the building looks finished. But if you go inside, it's nothing but bare concrete floors. There's no woodwork, no doors, no furniture. Somebody did at one time decide that they were going to at least put a bed in one of the rooms, and so if you look around on those 105 floors, you might find one king-size bed that is also covered with construction debris, but other than that, the hotel has been abandoned. My wife and I never consider taking a cruise to anywhere. We've talked about it, but only in a why would anyone do that sort of thing conversation. About the only time you see a cruise ship in the news is when it's on fire or it's flipped upside down. And since I don't fly anymore, I refer to my run-in with TSA and their less than secure thinking, I doubt we'll ever see Europe or Hawaii. I don't much care for how modern ships look either. They look more like floating carnivals than ships. Maybe that's why they're called the Carnival Cruise. If I were ever to take a cruise, I'd like it to be on an old-style ship. Something that looks like a ship. The SS United States was a passenger liner built in 1950 and 51 for the United States Line at a cost of $79.5 million. Why is it when I say that, I hear Dr. Evil's voice? 79.4 million. Anyway. The ship is the largest ocean liner constructed entirely in the United States and the fastest ocean liner to cross the Atlantic in either direction. To this day, it retains the Blue Ribbon Award for the highest average speed since her maiden voyage in 1952. She was designed by an American naval architect, William Francis Gibbs, and could be converted into a troop ship if required by the Navy in a time of war. This wasn't so long after World War II, and people were still thinking it just might happen again. The United States maintained an uninterrupted schedule of transatlantic passenger service until 1969, but it was never used as a troop ship, unlike the Queen Mary, which made several trips hauling troops. Well, today, troops go mostly by air. In 1969, the SS United States was no longer considered profitable to run. The cost of fuel far exceeded the profits of transporting people from one side of the pond to the other. Few people wanted to spend days at sea crossing the ocean when they could be packed like sardines into an airplane and fly there in a few hours. The trip was no longer as important as the destination. My wife and I drive all over the country. Instead of seeing the inside of airports, the inside of airplanes, and the inside of hotels, we take the RV and we see the country. The Grand Canyon is too beautiful to describe, and looking at photos is nothing like seeing the place up close and personal. We've seen a lot of the country, parts that most people just fly over and then hear about later on. The SS United States sat tied up to a pier while the owners tried to come up with a plan to make it cost-effective once more. The plans never came into focus, and so the ship was sold once again. The new owners moved the ship to a dock in Norfolk, Virginia. In 1977, a financial group run by Harry Katz considered purchasing the ship and docking it in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where it'd be used as a hotel and casino, kind of like the Queen Mary. However, nothing ever came of this plan. The vessel was sold in the following year for $5 million to a group headed by a Seattle developer, Richard H. Hadley, who hoped to fix up the liner and use it in a timeshare cruise ship function. Once more, the cost of converting the ship outstripped the profits. 1979, Norwegian Cruise Line was interested in purchasing the SS United States and converting it into a cruise ship that would travel to the Caribbean, but they decided they would buy the SS France instead. During the 1980s, the United States was considered by the U.S. Navy to be converted into a troop ship or a hospital ship, to be called the USS United States, but this plan never materialized. Instead, they developed two San Clemente class supertankers into hospital and troop ships. In a bid to recoup their investments, the ship was stripped of its furnishings and fittings. The interior was found to contain a lot of asbestos that had to be dealt with. Once all the money that could be squeezed from the aging ship had been acquired, the hull was moved to a pier, number 82 in South Philadelphia in 1984. The ship found itself being registered as a historic site. This would hopefully keep it afloat, if not actually out in the water. The 2003 Norwegian Cruise Line purchased the ship, hoping to put it back into service, but these plans fell through as well. The SS United States Conservancy assumed ownership of the United States in February 1st, 2011. December 10th, 2018, the Conservancy announced an agreement with a commercial real estate firm, RXR Realty of New York City, to explore options for restoring and developing the ocean liner. RXR had expressed interest in developing an out-of-commission ocean liner as a hotel and an event venue, which was supposed to be parked at Pier 57 in New York. The SS United States never arrived in New York, but the plans hadn't gone away completely. Until a location can be found and the money acquired, the ship is still sitting in limbo, waiting to see what the future might hold. You can look for images of the SS United States, but it's nothing to look at today. Mostly just rust. For all intents and purposes, the SS United States sits abandoned, waiting for someone to cough up the money needed to put it back into shape. Hopefully this will happen long before it settles to the bottom of the port. Cyprus is a Greek island officially known as the Republic of Cyprus. It's located in the eastern Mediterranean and is the third largest and third most populous island in the Mediterranean. It's just south of Turkey, west of Syria and Lebanon, and northwest of Israel. It's also north of Egypt and southeast of Greece. The island has been invaded numerous times over the last few thousand years. Everybody wants this island. August 16th, 1960, Cyprus attained independence after the Zurich-London Agreement between the United Kingdom, the last group of people who had invaded, Greece, and Turkey. Cyprus had a total population of 573,566 people, of whom 77% were Greek, 18% were Turks, and 4.5% other. This was just the people living there. This did not include the thousands of tourists who flocked there. Soon the island turned into a tourist destination like no other. Folks wanted to bask in the Mediterranean sun and enjoy the nice weather. Fancy hotels were built all along the coast. Expensive shops opened on every street. Restaurants were all along the streets of the tourist district. Things were looking good for the folks living on the island as tourists from all over the planet came to relax and spend their money. Nicosia International Airport was the principal airport for Cyprus from its initial construction in the 30s as a Royal Air Force station, known as RAF Nicosia, until 1974. At first it was principally a military airport, and it was still owned by the British Ministry of Defense. That year, the airport terminal was to be redesigned, and the runway was going to be extended to allow bigger, more modern commercial aircraft to bring in more tourists. The British were removing all military planes, and the field was to become a civil airport. Just as this construction was about to begin, things went south fast. July 15th, 1974, the Greek military junta under Demetrius Ioannidis, darn Greek names are hard to pronounce, Demetrius Ioannidis carried out a coup in Cyprus with the intentions of reuniting the island with Greece. The military ousted President Macarius III and replaced him with a pro-Greek nationalist, Nikos Samson. The coup had taken place so quickly that none of the folks living on the island even knew anything had really happened until it was all over. The coup took place so fast none of the people living on the island knew what had happened until the next morning when they woke and discovered that the government had been ousted and a new government had taken place. 5 days later, July 20th, 1974, the Turkish army invaded the island, claiming they had a right to intervene in order to restore the constitutional order from a 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. This justification had been rejected by the United Nations and the international community, but like most things involving the UN, it carried no actual force. As the Turks pushed forward from the east end of the island, the tourists all got busy abandoning ship or island as fast as they could. A few, if any, stopped to grab their belongings. Most made a mad dash for the airport or jumped on their yachts and got the heck out of there. The Turkish Air Force began bombing Greek positions in Cyprus, and hundreds of paratroopers were dropped in areas between Nicosia and Kyrenia. For years leading up to the invasion, Turkish Cypriots were being armed and prepared for this day. Kind of makes you wonder how the Turkish army justified this as a response to the coup. It sounds more like they had been behind the military takeover so they could use it to invade. The Turkish troop ships landed 6,000 men, as well as tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles. 3 days later, a ceasefire had been agreed to. Turkey had landed 30,000 troops on the island. They'd captured Kyrenia, the corridor linking Kyrenia to Nicosia, and the Turkish Cypriot quarter of Nicosia. A junta in Athens, followed by Samson's regime in Cyprus, fell from power. In Nicosia, Glafkos Cleridis assumed the presidency, and he replaced the constitutional order to the island. The whole pretext for the Turkish invasion was now nullified, but after the peace negotiations in Geneva, the Turkish government reinforced their Crimea bridgehead and started a second invasion on August 14th. The invasion resulted in the seizure of Morphou and Carpus, Famagusta, and the Messoria. Darn Greek names. International pressure led to a ceasefire, and by then 36% of the island had been taken over by the Turks. 180,000 Greek Cypriots had been evicted from their homes in the northern end of the island, while at the same time about 50,000 Turkish Cypriots were displaced to the north and were settled in properties that had been taken from the displaced Greeks. Lots of yelling took place throughout the world, and when everything was said and done, nothing was done. After the restoration of the constitutional order and the return of Archbishop Macarius III to Cyprus in December 1974, the Turkish troops remained, occupying the northeastern portion of the island. In 1983, the Turkish Cypriot leader proclaimed the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which Turkey is the only country on the planet that recognizes it. The Turkish forces had advanced as far as Attila Line, which is now the United Nations buffer zone between the Greek and Turkish administrative areas of Cyprus. Located about 2 miles north of this buffer zone was the beach resort city of Famagusta. The early 1970s, Famagusta was one of the most popular beach holiday destinations in the world and was a favorite destination of the rich and famous. It was known for its sunny beaches, glamorous shopping, and dining experience and excellent luxury hotels. The Varosha quarter, which was the tourist center of the city, has remained abandoned since the Turkish government fenced it off immediately after the conflict. Today, the district stands as a monument to what the world would look like without its human inhabitants. Tables are still set for breakfast. Model 1970 cars still sit in the garages, and designer clothes still hang on the racks of hastily abandoned shops. Nature has begun to take over, and many of the buildings are slowly collapsing. The cars rusting, the pavement is cracking and overgrown with weeds. The Varosha quarter is only accessible to Turkish military forces, the occasional journalist, and the UN officials. It is also being used by writers and scientists as an ongoing study of how cities fare after the inhabitants have disappeared. The photos of the beach show umbrellas still sitting by the water, slowly dissolving into the sunlight. Just about every window has broken over the years, and the concrete is beginning to crumble. Cars are rusting away, and clothes hanging in the store windows are falling to the floor. It's odd that the Turks don't want the area, but they don't want the Greeks to have it either. Kind of like we don't want it, but you can't have it. If you take the time, you can find photographs from June 1974 of the town. Tourists everywhere, shops filled with what was the latest fashions back then. Brand new cars everywhere. And then do a little digging and you can find the same location from just a few years ago. Same spot, but quite a difference. I hope tonight's show was entertaining and informative. It was fun to put together. You can find the archives on YouTube and the past 2 years' worth at strangethings.podomatic.com. My latest book about Fort McIntosh is coming together, but I could still use some stories if you know anybody that attended class at Laredo Junior College or Laredo Community College. Even if it's something you heard from your father or your grandmother. Once I have the basic story, I can do a little research and see if there's really anything to it or not. But I can always use the information if you're out there and you want to send me a line. Just send it to strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?